And this is the Abolish the Fed, Now What panel. It's been pretty hot here in Las Vegas. The heat's been relentless. Thank you. How many of you have been outside and enjoyed the heat? You know, the Federal Reserve is under a lot of heat and pressure right now. Do you understand that? What's going on with them? But before we get started, this isn't going to be a debate. This is going to be a panel discussion on what comes after the Fed is abolished. We're not here to hit the Fed hard. We're going to assume they're already terminal, at least what we have today. And so this distinguished panel is going to come up with what are alternatives we should consider after the Fed is abolished. But before we get started, I'd like a show of hands. I have to put my glasses on. I can't read with my glasses on. How many of you, seriously, this isn't rhetorically, how many of you really want to see the Fed totally abolished? Raise your hands. Okay. That seems like a lot of you. How many of you want to make the Fed more accountable, maybe work better, maybe audit it? How many are like, okay, that's, I'd say 10, 12%. Back in 2007, we had our first Freedomfest here in Las Vegas. We had about 700 attendees. And now we're up over 2,000. We don't know exactly how many we have this year. But the percentage of people wanting to abolish the Fed or fix the Fed probably wouldn't have been much higher at this conference than it would have been in 2007. But among the general public, all of this has totally changed. Here we're preaching to the choir. But we're really not preaching to the choir anymore. Let me just give you what I read quickly this morning in the news. There was some talk on the Sharon Ingle versus Harry Reid. He's leading 48 to 41%. It's no big deal one way or the other for this audience as far as the topic. But in the article it said she favors an audit of the Federal Reserve, eliminating the Internal Revenue Service. Who would have seen that in 2007? CNN Politics had an article yesterday on Ron Paul and would he run in 2012? And again, quoting, his adequacy of limited government and disdain for the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve is in trouble. We all know about the audit of the Fed, where they had over 320 members of the House come on as co-sponsors for that bill. Of course, they lost when it came down to a vote, but we are making history. So let's make a little bit of history here today. We're not here to bash the Federal Reserve. That's old news. What we're here to discuss, maybe for the first time in history, an audience of this size, and with C-SPAN, together with our distinguished panel here, to come up with alternatives for the future. What do we replace the Federal Reserve with? How do we transition from what we have today to a freer kind of banking system? So let's begin the process right now. Let's make history today. Let's come up with some good alternatives that the public can be made aware of, and let's change history and put the Federal Reserve as it is today in the history books where it belongs, okay? Let's start with the speakers. First, I'll introduce Peter Schiff over here. Everybody knows Peter. He's president of Eurocapital. Next is Jerry Jordan. He's the former president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. Jerry, just raise your hand. He can give us a lot of insight on the inside of what's been going on. He was president Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors. He was on that. He's been involved with Cato, and he's the past president of the National Association of Business Economists. Richard Rahn. Richard's a fellow at Cato Institute and chairman of the Institute for Global Economic Growth. If you'll notice, if you remember yesterday when he was moderating, he pretty much single-handedly started a Forbes for President in 2012 movement, if you heard him earlier. So we'll see what happens there. And finally, Governor Gary Johnson was going to be on the program, but he had a conflict, so we've asked Rick Mayberry to be on the panel. How many of you know or have read some of Rick Mayberry's great books and reports? Quite a few of you. I'll give you a little bit about him. He was publisher of U.S. and World Early Warning Report for Investors. He bases all of his work on common law, and he bases it basically on 2 points. Do all you have agreed to do, and do not encroach on other persons or their property. I think that's a great precept to live by as individuals, for our politicians, and for our government. So let's get started. We're going to start. Who wants to start on the panel? Rick, I think you did. Okay. They're going to cover some alternatives. Where do we go from here? They may discuss the gold standard, currency boards, free banking, maybe private ownership of the Fed or of a central bank. So, Rick, why don't you get started and give us about 7 minutes on your ideas.
I think what comes after the Fed is very much dependent on how the Fed disappears. Is Congress just suddenly going to get sane and abolish it, or are mobs going to burn it down, or just how does it depart? And if it departs in an unplanned fashion, then the question of what comes after becomes much more problematical than if it's a planned fashion. But I think that we're already seeing a lot of what will come after the Fed developing now, which is that there's an increasing interest in using various so-called investments as money. People are beginning to see things like shares of stock as what an author long ago named Adam Smith, that's his pen name, about 30 years ago or 40 years ago, I don't know. He came up with the idea of super money, which is assets that are very liquid, can be traded, they earn income, and that they can be used as money in transactions. Instead of paying in dollars, you might pay in, some sort of stock, let's say, or some sort of bonds, or something that is a financial asset that does earn income. And as people are getting more and more afraid of paper currencies around the world, they seem to be moving in that direction of trying to withdraw from the monetary systems altogether, dump all of their currencies, or as much as they can, and move over into not just gold, silver, platinum, but stocks and real estate and whatever they can get into that's out of paper money. And I think that this was actually predicted by Frederick Hayek, great economist, who pointed out that money right from the very beginning should have been just considered another commodity, and that the markets would present it in various forms to people, and they would choose which commodities or which money they would want to use. And some people would choose Swiss francs, and others British pounds, US dollars, whatever, and there'd be a competition, and some of these currencies would just shake out and go away because they would be less trusted, and others would become more trusted and would become more widely traded currencies. And I think that as central banks around the world get more and more desperate and try more and more crazy things, we're going to see this competition among forms of wealth that can be traded developing more and more. And so we're actually already seeing some of what would come after the demise of the Fed.
Yeah. Well, ideally I think what would follow the Fed is what preceded the Fed. We made it as a nation until 1913 without a Federal Reserve. We went through the Industrial Revolution without the Federal Reserve. What I would like to see happen is a return to the constitutional monetary system that the framers of our Constitution envisioned. And so from the point of view of the United States government, I think the Treasury would go back to coining money, and coining money is taking money, which constitutionally is gold and silver, and making coins out of it. and issuing coins. Notes, note currency, the bills that we carry around, those bills existed prior to 1913. They just were by the Federal Reserve Bank. They were issued by others. To go to Bank of America, for example, and you want to borrow $100,000, they don't issue their own notes to you. They rediscount Federal Reserve notes to you. That's what dollars are. They are Federal Reserve notes. Even though it says $1 on it, that's not what it is. It is a note. It claims to be. It says Federal Reserve note, this note. And so it is a promise to pay. It used to be a promise to pay dollars, but now it's a promise to pay nothing. It's just a piece of paper. But before banks were issuing Federal Reserve notes, they issued their own notes. So if you were an entrepreneur and you wanted to take out a loan from the Bank of America, they would issue you 100,000 notes drawn on the Bank of America. And that's what happened. Prior to the Federal Reserve, there were bank notes floating around the country. And one of the reasons for the Federal Reserve was because, let's say you lived in New York and you traveled out to California and you had in your billfold some notes from a bank in New York and you wanted to spend them. You know, you could take the, bank notes and spend them just the way you spend Federal Reserve notes. But what if the person in California didn't know? What if that bank failed? What if they weren't in business anymore? So the whole idea was to substitute a national note to replace all these individual notes because people would know it. But in today's day and age, with all the internet and the communications, it would be very easy for someone in California to verify the legitimacy of a bank note drawn on a New York bank. So I don't think that's an issue today. You know, when we originally established the Federal Reserve, there was an idea that we would have an elastic money supply. And what an elastic money supply meant was that the money supply would expand as the economy expanded, but then contract as the economy contracted. Well, as we now know, that doesn't happen. What happens is when the economy is growing, the money supply grows, and then when the economy contracts, it grows even faster. It never shrinks. It's now just an engine for perpetual inflation. That was one of the main reasons for the Federal Reserve. It no longer exists. So ideally, if we can simply go back to real money, constitutional money, where the government simply coins money, which is all that was given the power to do in the first place. In fact, when they first wrote the Constitution, there was a movement to allow Congress to issue bills of credit, and it was struck down. I think it was 9-3 vote. We didn't want the federal government printing money. And in fact, the reason that the Federal Reserve is a private bank, it is not part of the federal government. It is a private banking syndicate. One of the ways that you know this, if you ever get a letter from the Federal Reserve, it's got a stamp on it. If you get a letter from the government, there's no stamp because it's, this is a private. They actually pay a tax. The Federal Reserve pays a tax to Congress. They're allowed to make a certain return on their assets, which is why the Federal Reserve building is so expensive, because they know whatever they earn is going to be paid to government in a tax, but it's private. The reason constitutionally the Federal Reserve had to be private was because Congress cannot do what the Fed does, because Congress did not have the power to issue bills of credit. So if we can simply restore the monetary system envisioned by our framers, we can achieve two things. We can eliminate inflation, and we can go back to the deflationary environment that we had prior to the Fed. You know, in 1900, prices were half of what they were in 1800. You know, so without the Fed, Americans enjoyed a rising standard of living and falling prices. I know today, you talk to your grandparents and they're going to say, oh, gee, I remember when I was a kid, that only cost a nickel. Now it costs so much money. Well, our grandparents, their grandparents were telling them, gee, when I was a kid, it was half the, it was twice as much. Now it's cheaper. So we would go back to falling prices, which benefit everybody, and we would cut off the ability of the government to run deficits. The government would have to shrink because the government would only have the gold that it collected to spend. It couldn't simply print money and monetize its debt. So I think the country would function very well without the Fed. The problem is, can we ever get there? My fear is if we ever abolish the Fed, we would simply turn the printing presses over to Congress, and they would be even be more irresponsible than the Fed. When people in the audience raised their hand, they said, they want to make the Fed more accountable. The idea is to make it less accountable. If we're going to have it at all, let's have it completely independent from the political process, so they have the guts to stand up to Congress and not buy their bonds and raise interest rates when they have to be raised, instead of keeping them artificially low and perpetuating these booms and busts.
Thank you, Peter. So no one here wants the Congress taking over, is that correct? Okay. Richard?
Well, there's a bit of a problem. The Fed was put in place in part because of the deflation we had in the late 1800s. We went through a series of what they used to call panics, recessions today, and really it was the panic of 1908 that spurred much of the activity for the Fed. The goal is not to have deflation, the goal is not to have inflation, but you want your money to have stable purchasing power. How do you do that? Well, when they had gold or even commodity baskets, you can approach that. But the problem with gold is, when you have a high growth economies as we've had throughout the world for the last decade or two, the money supply of pure gold does not keep up with the growth in the economy. Bob Mundell, who was the father of the euro, has estimated the price of gold need to be $15,000 an ounce to provide to move to a gold standard today. And you'll have a continuing problem if you just try to stick with gold. I mean, you will have persistent deflation. You can cope with it, as we did in late 1700s. A lot of us try to sit around and think, what are ideal monetary standards? I'm a great fan of Hayek. I'm a Hayekian. And I loved his book, The Denationalization of Currency. And at the time, Hayek was primarily talking about commodity baskets. And you can approach something that gives you a fair amount of price stability. But the world has so changed now in the last, it's been 30 years, 35 years since Keynes wrote the book Denationalization on money. And we look at how your purchases are. Now, this is a BlackBerry. Most of you have that, and iPads and all the rest. How much of your money is spent on basically information items, software and computer-related things, as opposed to really hard goods? Food, we go back to the founding of the country, food was 70% of what most people spent on. So if you had a commodity basket based on corn, wheat, other grains, and maybe a few basic metals tossed in, you could approximate what people's changes in wealth really were. In the modern age, it's going to be increasingly difficult. We abolish the Fed. Somebody has to determine what the U.S. government pays its bills in and what it requires in terms of taxes. So somebody has to come up with the legal tender and define precisely what that is. The Constitution does not define that. The Constitution only gives the government the power to mint coins, but doesn't specify what they are and how the value of the dollar should be established. I'm one who would love to abolish the Fed, but it is, when you start to think of what comes afterwards, it's not a simple proposition. And also, institutions don't really go away. As an aside, perhaps the oldest institution still in existence is the Rome Waterworks, and that's been around for over 2,500 years. The water has always been on in Rome, even during the darkest of the dark ages. And we look at organizations like the IMF, which should have been abolished after Bretton Woods. You look at each of these institutions. The Fed was supposed to give us stable money. It's now worth 1/22 of what it was